Welcome to this PowerPoint presentation about leader-member exchange theory and the effects of being a bad boss. Now, sometimes a person who's a bad boss is a bad boss across the board. They're just bad at everything and they're equally unpleasant to all of the employees. But sometimes you find a situation where an individual is sort of a good boss, a good manager, a good leader to some employees, and a bad boss to other employees. And one perspective that explains how this can happen is something known as leader-member exchange theory. According to this perspective, leaders act differently toward different members of the organization. There's an in-group. These are people that are favored by the boss. They have a special relationship with the leader. They're kind of on the inside. They're trusted by the leader. They get information first. They get preferential treatment. The other people are in the out-group. Now, sometimes the outgroup is actively treated badly and discriminated against, but much of the time they're just simply ignored. It's as if the only employees that matter to the boss are the ones that are members of the in-group. Not surprisingly, in-group members display more job satisfaction than out-group members, and they also have better performance as well. Now, this arrangement doesn't always occur for sinister reasons. It's not as if the boss intentionally sets out to favor some employees over others. But what tends to happen is there's time pressure, things have to be decided quickly, there's only a limited number of people that one can communicate with, and there's a tendency to share information and communicate with people that you're more familiar with, people you've known longer, people from similar backgrounds, people that you're comfortable with. And this is one of the reasons why increasing the diversity of organizations matter. Because people behave that way, there's a tendency for people at the top to favor other people who are like themselves. So if you have a bunch of white males running the show, they're probably going to be more comfortable communicating with and associating with other white males who have similar backgrounds to themselves. And this effectively shuts women and minority employees out of the loop at the top, and it makes it harder for them to get ahead. So leader-member exchange theory is one way of understanding how this preferential treatment comes to be in work organizations. And the evidence is clear. The inappropriate use of power and status by supervisors affects employee morale and performance, and treating some employees better than others have long-lasting effects in organizations. One of the classic examples of this is a very old study that was done in a General Electric plant where they made tubes for televisions and other electronic appliances. We no longer have vacuum tube kinds of appliances, but these were things that were made out of glass and metal, and they were essentially having things like televisions work. Anyway, in this tube plant at General Electric, for 3 weeks, work groups of 5 to 11 people on the regular assembly jobs were given either favorable or unfavorable treatment by their supervisors. Now, the groups were matched in age, productivity, seniority, disciplinary record, so they would have 2 different groups of employees that were similar in every possible way, but one of them was going to be treated favorably while the other was treated unfavorably. Now, the favorable group was praised, their bosses were friendly and helpful, and they avoided any irritating incidents or conflicts at all in these groups. In the unfavorable group, however, the employees were regularly threatened with time and motion studies, there were attacks on the quality of their work, and they contrived all kinds of irritating incidents just to piss people off. For example, one day they brought in these big tubs full of grease and slime and dirt, and they were full of washers, metal washers that go with nuts and bolts and so forth. And people had to sort through all this gunk to get the washers out and clean them off. And so for 3 weeks, you had these 2 different groups of people having very different working conditions. At the end of 3 weeks, the jobs were changed to a new kind and the differential treatment ended. But the results were kind of interesting. If you take a look at this slide, you can see that the numbers represent the percentage of units that were defective. In other words, what percent of the stuff that the people were producing on the assembly line needed to be sent back for repair. So the higher the number is, the worse the performance. So if you look at what happened during the first week of the preferential treatment, the groups weren't that different. The unfavored group was doing a slightly worse, but the difference wasn't that big. But over the next 2 weeks, you can see that the number of units requiring repair were much higher in the group that was treated badly than in the group that was treated well. And what's interesting is even after the preferential treatment ended and the groups were now treated the same, there was a lingering, long-lasting after effect of the bad treatment. You'll notice that in the first, the second, and even the third and fourth weeks after the changeover, the production quality of the people that had been treated badly was tremendously worse than for the people that were treated well. So the effects of having a bad boss can linger even after that boss is no longer there. So given all of the downsides of being a bad boss, you're creating more hassles for yourself. Your workers aren't going to be as productive, they're not going to be as happy, there's going to be more conflict. This makes your life tougher. And yet, in organization after organization, we regularly encounter bosses who seem to go out of their way to make things bad. Many of you have probably had a bad boss in the jobs that you've had already in life. And I wish I could tell you that this wasn't going to happen to you later on, but unfortunately that's not true. And part of the reason I think is bosses often just don't get trained very well. People end up in positions of management and they're completely unprepared for what's going to happen. One of the things that I hope will be a side effect of your taking this class is you'll be a little more conscious of these kinds of things to do and not to do when you yourself are in a position of management. In case you don't recognize him, the guy that's pictured on this slide is a guy whose name was Lundberg from the movie Office Space, which is probably at least 20 years old now, but it's a classic capturing what goes on in work organizations. For those of you that haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. But there are links to video clips from this movie on the webpage for this course under this module. And you're not going to learn anything psychological wise by watching these, but I recommend them because they're very entertaining and they show bad bosses in action. So without further ado, let me read you some actual examples of bad bosses from out there in the real world. This is one from a woman named Elizabeth B. in Georgia. After I'd been working in a small market agency for 2 years, my boss called me into his office one afternoon and told me I was finally receiving a promotion and a raise. I was elated, but when I reminded him about it the next day, he reneged. I started to argue, but he cut me off. "You know better than to take me seriously in the afternoons," he said. "I'm drunk every afternoon." Here's another one from Kristen J. in Tennessee. I was 5.5 months pregnant, and the principal decided it was time we had a chat about dress code, my dress code. "I don't know if you are aware, but your body is changing," she said awkwardly. "I'm concerned because your breasts have become inappropriately large for a secondary school teacher." Long, uncomfortable pause. "That's all," she said, dismissing me. She never did say what she expected me to do about the problem. Here's one from Phil P. in Pennsylvania. I stayed late with my boss fielding customer queries, but after one call, a look of horror crossed his face. "I have to get out of here," he yelled. "That was my girlfriend. Her husband is in a motorcycle gang, and he just found out about me. He's on his way over here right now." The husband had never laid eyes on him, he said, but knew he worked late nights at the newspaper. My boss then left me with these words: "Keep answering phone calls from the customers," and out the door he went. Being eager to please, I stayed put, but then it hit me. My boss was setting me up. He was hoping I'd be mistaken for the boyfriend. I quickly grabbed my coat, turned out the lights, and got out of there. Here's one from B.O. in Montclair, New Jersey. At my old office, one of the bosses went crazy and threw his computer out the window, 50 floors above street level. It bounced on a ledge a few stories down and stayed there, thankfully. Later, he was taken out of the office in a straitjacket. Oddly, he returned to work a month later. Here's one from Bona B. from Long Beach, California. It was a typical hectic Friday afternoon at our law office. My boss, meanwhile, was hundreds of miles away at a luxury resort preparing for a meeting. In the midst of my insane day, I got an urgent call from him. "You have to phone the hotel right away. It's important," my boss said. "Ask them to send someone to the pool area immediately." "What's wrong?" I asked. "We haven't seen a waiter in 20 minutes and we need our drinks refreshed." Here's one from Terry H. in Kansas. The front office asked us to figure out the square footage dedicated to each department in our clothing store. To save time, I suggested we count the ceiling tiles above each department. They're each 2 square feet. Counting the tiles would give us an accurate dimension of each department without having to work around all the displays, I explained. My boss hated the idea. "Hello," she said sarcastically. "We need the square footage of the floor, not the ceiling." And here's one from Wendy Brown in Illinois. After I worked through lunch to help my boss with a report, he offered to show his appreciation by taking me out for a bite. The place he had in mind had a wonderful buffet, he said, with foods from around the world. I was absolutely salivating with each detail. So what was his idea of an exotic dining establishment? Sam's Club. We spent the hour dining on the free samples they handed out. Here's one from Nancy E. in Massachusetts. On my first day at a new job, I arrived to find someone in the office that I'd been told would be mine. Puzzled, I went to find the person who had hired me, but she was away at a conference. So I told another person my story. She made a few calls, then told me to find a place to sit. "Don't speak to anyone," she ordered. Just wait for someone to find you something to do until your boss returns. Turns out, before my boss left town, she had forgotten to fire the person I was replacing. And here's one from Gail Snyder in Georgia. My boss was notoriously cheap, so when he handed me a birthday card, I was pleasantly surprised. "Thank you," I said. "You're welcome," he replied. "And when you get through reading it, take it to Robin down the hall. It's her birthday, too." And here are some examples of people that were fired for all kinds of insane reasons. A New Zealand police officer was axed for using bold uppercase letters in an email to coworkers on how to properly fill out forms. The company deemed the capital letters confrontational. Wells Fargo fired a customer service representative with 7 years on the job after discovering he'd put a cardboard cutout of a dime in a laundromat washing machine nearly 50 years earlier. A waiter in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, claims he was let go after leaving his post to help a woman who was being carjacked in the parking lot. A fashion model was reportedly fired for being too fat. The model is 5'10" and weighed 120 pounds. And finally, a Chicago car salesman was shown the door for wearing a Green Bay Packers tie to work.